Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are live on LinkedIn, and this is a Reviewer Credits Ask Us Anything event. It's great to be back after a short break. My name's Gareth Dyke. I work for Reviewer Credits on academic content and connections, and I'm delighted to be joined in our event today by a new friend, a new special guest, Louise. Dr. Louise, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm great. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm fantastic. Thank you very much. Why don't we get started by
Let's
asking
do
you
it.
to give us a quick introduction about yourself, please?
Hi, so I'm an academic writer and editor, founder of Academic Relations, my business. And one of my favorite things to work on is academic communications, specifically the toxic ones. And that's why I'm really interested to talk with you today about bad peer review, because that is where most of it, well, not most, but a lot of toxicity in academia can come out. And I have some solutions to help you get through it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're talking about peer review and negative experiences that you may have had as a researcher, submitting your work to journals and getting comments back. So, if you're joining us on LinkedIn and you'd like to ask a question or you'd like to make a comment, do put your comments into the LinkedIn comments, into the comments under this post, under this feed, and Dr. Louise and I will be delighted to answer any questions that you have. So let's get going. Let's get started. Louise, peer review experiences, negative ones. What would you say is the main function of peer review? Why do we do it? Why is it done by journals?
So peer review is very important to make sure that the research that we're putting out is accurate and correct and is actually advancing science. And, there's no such thing as, if you, I'm sorry, I'm getting lost in my thoughts here. I have never done a live before. Give me a second. Sorry, I don't know what
It's
to
all
say.
right. We have this
Okay,
cartoon to help us with all this kind of stuff. All these guys with sabers and battle axes and all the rest of it. Like authors often feel, right, Louise, that peer review is quite a negative experience. Have you experienced that yourself?
Yes, I have, and I've worked with a lot of authors that have had negative experiences with peer review. And often it's not that their research is bad, it's that the peer reviewers maybe didn't understand or they couldn't communicate effectively what they wanted different about the paper accepted for publication. But obviously, peer review has a great function a little better and help authors understand how to respond to comments that peer reviewers give them to strengthen their science. The point of this is not to reject papers. We want to accept the best ones and the best quality science possible.
Yeah, so peer review acts as a filter and it's there and it's in place
Yeah.
to hopefully be a positive process to help authors, researchers like improve the quality of their content as it moves through the peer review process. And we're really big at Reviewer Credits, helping authors and trying to encourage peer reviewers to be positive, to be constructive when they make comments on the work of others. But often, unfortunately, the peer review process is not that positive. And we're going to talk in a moment about some of those experiences that you've had, Louise, like working with researchers and looking at the kind of comments that come back. But let's just talk a little bit quickly about how we feel about the peer review process, its value in the academic community.
So peer review is definitely valued in the community. If a paper hasn't been peer reviewed, often it's not going to be accepted if it's cited in other papers as a reliable source of information. Now, there's a lot of preprint servers at the moment, like Research Square and bioRxiv, where people are uploading their papers before they get them published. However, there's still a perception that a peer-reviewed paper is the most reliable. So the preprints haven't really taken over yet. They're kind of a before you get published thing. And authors really want to get their papers published in high impact journals. It helps them get their job and progress in their career. So peer review is a really important thing and is still highly regarded. So if you're a researcher and you're trying to get a tenure track job, for example, if you have peer reviewed papers, you need those to get further in your career. But unfortunately, sometimes the bad experiences can detract scientists from even going that far in their career. So we need to do
Yes.
something about limiting those kind of experiences to keep these scientists interested in staying in science.
Yeah, so nurturing peer reviewers, keeping people interested in both participating in the peer review process as researchers and also doing it as peer reviewers. There's a big crisis in academic publishing at the moment, as everybody listening to this will know, like listening to this Reviewer Credits live event. It's really difficult to find people to do peer review for articles that get submitted to journals. And then, of course, we also get those peer reviewers who are not treating the process as a positive process. They're looking at papers and they're just being downright negative. This, of course, should be the process that we use to judge the quality of academic papers submitted for publication, and papers that we cite in the peer-reviewed literature are thought to be reliable because they've undergone that process. You mentioned preprint servers, Louise. Like, I know you worked for Research Square, the largest preprint server in the world. Could you explain a bit more about what a preprint server, a preprint platform is?
So if you have an article that's ready to go and you're planning to publish it, but you want to get it out there so that anyone can read it earlier. So preprint servers exist where you have control over when you release your manuscript, you retain ownership and copyright of that. You just put it on a server where others can read it. You can add it to your CV so people can read your research before it's been published. That's really helpful, for example, for grad students and postdocs who are looking for jobs, but they haven't quite published their work yet. But they will, and they need to show that they're capable of what the jobs they're applying for. So these are really useful tools for sharing your science to a wider community, and they really help facilitate communication among scientists and with people who are non-scientists. They're not hidden behind a paywall. You can just open them up and read them. And then there was a situation recently where a lot of Wiley journals were removed. So what happens to papers if you've published it and it disappears? Can you republish them? Probably not, because that journal likely retains the copyright. If you've preprinted, your preprint's never going to go away. So you will always be able to share that research. It will never just disappear, even if the journal you published in does.
We've got lots of content on our YouTube channel, lots of content on our website about preprint platforms if you're interested in learning more. Lots of authors ask us, like, well, won't it be possible for somebody to steal my research if I put it onto a preprint platform? Like, what would you say in response to that, Louise, as a former Research Square colleague?
Yes, absolutely. They could steal it, but no more so than they could steal it if you went to present it at a conference, for example, because usually people are presenting unpublished research at conferences. I believe it's relatively safe to put your research out there. You're going to be communicating with your colleagues about what you're working on regardless. So I don't think that there's that much of a risk. And so many people are doing it now that, yeah.
It's a good idea. It's a good way to get your work disseminated. It's a good way to get your work out there, get it peer reviewed openly by the research community, by other researchers working in your field. Journals will often look at preprint platforms and come and see if they would like to put that work into their journals. Let's start talking about negativity in peer review. I know that's what we're here to talk about. Like, what happens when you get those negative comments from a peer reviewer? What makes a bad peer review, Dr. Louise?
So there's multiple types of bad peer review, and I've seen a lot of peer review, reviewer response documents as an editor. So one of the ones, this is not actually very common, but I've seen it too many times, is where the reviewer will attack the author instead of their work. So they'll make personal attacks, ad hominem attacks, criticizing their intelligence, saying they shouldn't be scientists. I've seen this way too many times, and I'm not sure why people think that that's okay to do. It's not, in case you were wondering. And then there's unprofessional and nasty comments. Those are more like, they're focused on the research, but they're very poorly worded, where they might really put somebody off who's, maybe it's their first paper and you've got a reviewer saying, this paper is idiotic. That's not the best way to phrase that. And then there's some slightly more less obvious ones where if the reviewer is biased towards their methods or approaches and things that they use, they might actually disregard a paper because they would have done it differently. And that is not a valid reason to reject a study if the alternative methodology is good. And then we have inexperienced reviewers. I don't know about everyone watching this, but I was never trained in how to review a paper. I was given one and said, review this. So I taught myself. A lot of people I know taught themselves how to do it. And sometimes, as hard as we try, if we're not trained in something, we don't necessarily have the background and knowledge to know whether a study is good enough or not, and they might get rejected, recommend rejection, because the reviewer was inexperienced, not because the paper was bad. I've seen a couple of situations where a PI gave their grad student articles to review for them. So they were being reviewed by the PI according to the journal, but it was a grad student who did the review. And I remember one of them telling me, like, oh, I gave it back to my PI and I asked him for feedback, and he was like, oh, I just submitted it. I didn't even read it. That could have been a bad peer review for the author, because the person who did it wasn't trained, and the person they thought was doing the review didn't do it.
Oh wow, you raised a number of really important points in that section there. Like, no one gets any training really to do peer review. It's very, very, very uncommon for graduate students at universities, early career researchers, to receive any training in peer review. It was the same for me. I was just thrown in there and expected to be able to do peer review. That's something that we're really working hard to change at Reviewer Credits. So that's important. People are humans, and it's human nature to always look at work that you get asked to comment on in a negative way. That's just part of life. Like, if you give me a piece of work to comment on, I'm going to try to find the problems with it rather than trying to help people to improve it necessarily. So that's a mindset that we're also working on. Sorry, Louise.
That's it. I'm just saying that's a common experience. You want to pick it apart, but that's not the real focus of peer review. You're not trying to pick apart someone's research. You're trying to essentially make sure that everything is good enough, not good enough, but the standard is high enough. The experiments are valid. You're not trying to make it perfect, actually, just publishable.
We are working hard to try to encourage reviewers who engage with peer review to look at the process in a positive way and try to find ways to help authors improve their work rather than always picking holes and trying to find the biggest problems. So, inexperienced peer reviewers who've not gotten any training, human nature, where people always try to find problems with papers, with articles in peer review. And the last point that you made, Dr. Louise, ethics. Like, really, really important. This is a real problem. If I'm a senior professor and I get invited to make a peer review by a journal, it's quite often the case that I pass that off onto junior researchers working in my research group. They do the work on the peer review, but I submit it to the journal. So that's a huge issue. There's no credit being given to the person who actually did the work. So that's important, right? We should develop systems to provide credit to those junior researchers, wouldn't you say?
I would, and in fact, there's very little reward for doing peer review in academia, because most of it is anonymous. No one knows who you are. No one knows who's doing it. So people are very busy in academia, and they're essentially dedicating their time to this. If there was a way to get some kind of something out of it, I think that would solve some of the problems with peer reviewers, because I know that some of these bad peer reviews are because of a lack of time. People don't necessarily have the time to dedicate to sitting down for a couple of days to validate and have a look through these studies and give them the attention they deserve, because they're not getting paid. They're not getting any time away from their other work to do these reviews.
And that's the point of Reviewer Credits. Like, if you sign up on Reviewer Credits, you can get accredited for peer review. You can get rewarded for peer review. You can get things from journals that, provide you with that, time, that effort, that work that you do on peer review. You can spend the credits that journals give you in the Reviewer Credits Reward Center. So what makes a bad peer review? We've all seen it as editors. We've all seen it as authors. And I know, Louise, you did a survey recently on your social media talking to authors about this. Let's talk a little bit about this as well. Why does bad peer review happen? Why does it happen? Why do peer reviewers act in such a negative way?
So I think we've covered the lack of training and vetting here, but honestly, the anonymity, it's kind of like the internet. People will come online and they will hide behind a screen name and type things that they would never say in real life. If you get on Twitter and have a look at what some people say to each other, and just imagine that in a conference room, it would never happen. And peer review is very similar. If you're hiding behind anonymity, there's no accountability. You can say whatever you want. And some people just don't have the ability to filter themselves, because I'm going to talk a little bit later when we're going through the specific comments. Yes, there are very bad papers. There is bad science out there. If you get a bad science paper to review, that doesn't mean you get to be mean to the author. There's ways to say this study is awful in a way that's not going to make the authors feel bad, because we don't want to be tearing each other down here. There's a lot of that in academia, and it needs to go away, honestly. But anonymity is a huge problem. And I don't know if there's, are you working on a non-anonymous process that reviewer credits?
Now we're working with journals that use all kinds of processes. So journals that use double-blind peer review, journals that use like single-blind peer review. But yeah, like this is an issue. Like if I'm not going to have my identity revealed to the authors, then suddenly I feel that I can say more things. And strong biases that reviewers hold often bias their judgments. There's a bunch of work that's been done on that. You talked about the lack of proper training for reviewers. That's something that we're trying to address, and vetting by journals, by publishers of their reviewer pools. So let's have a look at some of the consequences of bad peer review. Again, from your own survey work, talking to researchers, Louise, consequences of bad peer review.
So obviously one of the biggest ones is discouraging researchers, and that kind of goes without saying. But I was just reading a post the other day about the review process and getting a paper published. Somebody had submitted a paper in 2019, and it's going to be published in 2025. This is a very long process already. If you have to retract your paper from consideration because of peer reviews that make you feel like you don't want to publish in that journal anymore, you're going to start the process again. If you have reviewers that come back over and over and over again with nitpicky things, and the editor isn't, controlling that and eventually publishing the paper, you could be going through this process for years. So it actually delays the dissemination of important research. And the whole point of doing and publishing research is to help things move forward, to help people, especially when you're, medical science. A paper that was done years ago, it's still going to be valuable. But think of all the studies that could have been done using that data if it was published earlier. So if you have a bad peer review, and it slows down this publication process even more, and it's already a slow process, so it hinders the progression of science. And that is a major problem.
Another reason for the use of preprint platforms, potentially.
Yes.
Like you can put your work on a preprint platform. The community of researchers that work in your area can look at it. Giacomo made a comment I can see here on LinkedIn. Too many papers get sent for peer review when they could have just been desk rejected. That's often much better for researchers, sending their papers to journals, getting a rejection. Nature journals usually do this within a week. You get that desk rejection back, you can at least move on to another journal. So
I completely agree, because that's a turnaround time of a week rather than some people are waiting for months, 6 months to a year to get a review back, and it's all every single reviewer is rejecting it. If it was desk rejected, they could have had that published in that time already.
Absolutely.
So I completely agree with that. Yeah.
So consequences of bad peer review, we all see it all the time. We've all experienced it. I know I have.
I just want to come back before we move on, because you mentioned something about the value of pre-printing here. Just make sure before you preprint that the journals you want to publish in will accept pre-printed papers. And there is a list. I wish I could tell you exactly where. If you search online a list of papers that accept pre-printed papers, you will find a pretty comprehensive list of the ones that do and the ones that don't. Because you don't want to preprint and then find that you can't publish in that journal you've always wanted to publish in.
Do you have an approximate percentage, the number of journals out there that are keen on pre-printing, would you say?
Oh, I honestly don't. And the last time that I looked into this was probably a year and a half ago. So I think that the acceptance rate of those has probably gone up quite a lot since then. And I would say that it was like 50 to 60%.
Great. So have a think about your target journal.
More like 80%, but that's just a guess. I would go and have a look at that. Just make sure that your journal that you want to publish in will accept that.
So this is another reason why it's important to think about your target journal before you make your initial submission. If you're thinking about pre-printing, again, we've got lots more content on our YouTube channel, on our website about open peer review and about preprint platforms if you're interested in that. Consequences of negative peer review. I feel that we're getting a bit too positive in this particular session, Dr. Louise. Let's go negative now. Let's really have a look at some of those peer review nightmares. These are real examples, right? That people have
They
sent
are.
to you.
I will read this out for you. This author's English is so bad that I can't take any of the science seriously. Have someone who knows how to structure a sentence rewrite the entire manuscript if you want credibility. That's the tone I imagine that was written in. Unfortunately, this is real. This is a real example that I was given permission to share anonymously. This brings up several points that I want to mention here, and this is one of the most common things that I see. The most common comment in a review is, have this paper edited. It's not this, obviously. This is written very strongly compared to that. Have this paper edited by a native speaker is the word that they will often use. And if you are reviewing a paper, I would suggest not saying that. I would use professionally edited or by a colleague who is fluent in English. So, I mean, the point of this article, this review here, is they're saying the article needs to be edited in a very forceful way. And the appropriate way to reword that would be, while the content of this manuscript is promising, the language and sentence structure need significant work, I recommend the author seek the assistance from a professional editor. And the reason I wouldn't say native speaker, I know a whole lot of editors who are not native English speakers who would edit your paper so much better than my neighbor's 5-year-old son who is a native speaker. It's not about whether you're a native speaker. And that makes a difference. Just remember, you don't necessarily know who wrote the paper you're reviewing.
So stay positive, right? Like try to look for the good things in authors' manuscripts.
Let's have another look. The person you're saying get a native English speaker to read your paper might be a native speaker. It's making sure that you're using words that aren't judgmental in your responses. But it's not appropriate. The previous one, it's definitely not appropriate to be unprofessional like that. And that was bordering on attacking the author. That was almost an ad hominem attack. Not quite. But there's nothing about bad English that makes somebody's science inherently not credible.
What about this one? The entire study is irrelevant.
Yes. So this one is, so instead of dismissing the study outright here, the peer reviewer may believe this study is irrelevant, but this comment gives the author absolutely no context as to why. How are they supposed to improve their paper if they don't know what it is that the reviewer thought was irrelevant about it? So instead of dismissing it, they want to provide specific guidance on how to enhance the relevance. So, a paper like this might get a comment like that if they haven't clearly articulated its contribution to the field. So the reviewer might instead say, it would be helpful to explain how the findings address existing gaps in the literature to solve this problem. When you write a comment like this, it's just basically, this is bad, with no indication of why or how to fix it. That's not helping progress science. That is not helping the authors make their studies better. It's just being negative.
We'll talk about how you can talk to editors about these kinds of comments in a moment, but example number 3, and this is my favorite one because it's, I think, the rudest of all of them that you've collected in your survey, Louise.
The authors should consider a different career. They clearly don't belong in research. Could you imagine being an early career researcher and getting that comment back from a reviewer? There's a lot of people who, even if they say that doesn't bother me, it does bother you. You don't want to have somebody say that to you, especially people spend years on their projects. And a study, the way that it's written, the reviewer has no basis for saying that somebody doesn't belong in research whatsoever. But obviously they felt that this study wasn't up to the standards of being published in a scientific journal. And so how could they have said that? Not in that way. So they could have said there's several fundamental issues with the study that need to be addressed, perhaps mentioning the design and methodology. And they could suggest that the authors seek mentorship or collaboration with more experienced researchers to strengthen their future submission. So don't tell them they don't belong in research. Suggest ways that they can strengthen their science to produce better papers later. You don't just tell someone you don't belong here. If you are a reviewer, you have a responsibility to actually help people. Not
building people up rather than smacking them down. Right, exactly. And this one as well, I liked as well. This is another one. This paper isn't worth my time to review properly.
Yeah. So why do you think they might have said that?
Well, they feel that their time's been wasted. They've been asked to review a paper that, is beneath them. Maybe they're too arrogant, too highfalutin to actually, spend time working on this paper, but it's not the kind of comment that you'd, again, as you said before, like if you're an early career researcher starting off, like this kind of thing can really make an impact, can really affect you. So
Yeah.
let's stay positive.
So the person who actually sent me that one, interestingly, thought that it was left in by mistake. And that was an email response to the editor when they were asked to peer review the paper. So it somehow made it into the communication that was sent to them, which I thought was interesting because somebody wasn't clearly paying attention to what was getting sent to the authors.
Okay, so the editor's not checking properly.
Yeah,
right.
Somebody might say something like this if the paper is just very challenging to understand. So you might say, I find it challenging to provide a detailed review as the manuscript does not contain enough information. If it's just, a few pages of text and maybe one figure, if it's a paper that's just not fully formed to the paper yet, or if, they could write redesign, evaluation of the study's design and methods is necessary before it can be considered for publication. You don't have to be, oh, it's not worth my time. It takes just as long to write a comment like what I just said than it does to write.
Exactly. And we've
being
got a question from
and professional, acknowledging the need for significant improvements while providing a rationale for your difficulty in reviewing something is a professional approach instead of just, I don't have time for this.
So what should editors do when they see reviewer comments like this? Paul is asking in our LinkedIn chat, like especially considering it's very difficult for editors these days to find peer reviewers. Like we all know this to be the case, sending 10, 20, 30, 40 emails just to find one peer reviewer. If you're an editor, Louise, and you get a comment like this back, what should you do? I mean, I would,
not pass it on, honestly, to the authors. I think that editors should be removing offensive comments like this. Perhaps having the paper reviewed again, unfortunately, which is difficult if again, it was a long process. Maybe you couldn't find a reviewer. But if you ask enough reviewers, if you say you get 3 or 4 reviews and somebody comes back, because you're not going to get 3 or 4 horrible reviewers in one go. You can just take out that reviewer from consideration. And then, I mean, if I was an editor, I would want to talk to them about not doing that, and give them some advice on how to word comments. If you get an awful paper and you think the science is terrible, how do you communicate that in a way that's not offensive?
Right. Editors are there to act as gatekeepers to make sure that the comments that go between the reviewers and the authors are good, meaningful, helpful. I mean, there are a number of other issues that we've seen as editors over the years. Authors get asked to add citations to papers that particular peer reviewer has written. That's not ethical. That's a problematic request. Make changes potentially in papers to more favorably reflect somebody's earlier work. Remove or modify hypotheses to placate that peer reviewer. And again, as Paul is asking in our chat, like if you have an issue with a peer review as an author, as a researcher, don't be afraid to write to the editor because they are there to help. You can write to the journal editor, ask for help. Journal editors are supposed to police the peer review process, right, Louise?
Yes, but sometimes things don't happen that way because there's such a huge volume of papers. Things are going to slip through the cracks. I mean, I had a client who was asked to write a paper by a journal. It went through one round of reviews and it got rejected because that journal doesn't accept the type of paper that it was. And so he wrote to them and said, but I was asked to write this. And it had just kind of slipped through the cracks somewhere and it was immediately then accepted. But if something seems weird, ask the editor because they may have missed something. It might not, if he could have just been like, oh, they rejected it. Okay, move on. No, it was just a mistake. It was just an administrative error. So if you do have a problem with the peer review, always ask the editor. That's what they're there for, partially. Right. And if you get a response to your paper and you want to do a response to a reviewer's document, you can ask the editor first. If there are some offensive comments in there, if you have, you could perhaps take them out because you don't have to respond to somebody who's calling you an idiot. That's not necessarily beneficial for you or the journal. But if you are going to respond to them, as much as it might be tempting to respond back exactly as they spoke to you or wrote to you, if you are the one that maintains professionality, say, thank you for this consideration. I don't I respectfully disagree, and then explain why you disagree. If you then go to the editor or the journal and say, I had this issue with peer review, and they're looking at your response and what you're responding to, you're going to come out as the professional one. If you turn it into like a back and forth, go down to their level essentially, and give them, that doesn't look good on you. So if you can maintain that professionalism as much as you probably don't want to, you can tell everyone else what you're really thinking. Just don't put it on that document.
Right. I always say that, peer reviewers can say what they like. They don't have to have evidence really necessarily for what comments that they make. But you've got to have like a strong backup as a researcher, as an author. You've got to have evidence. You've got to stay polite. That's absolutely critical. So we've got some examples here in the comments. Yeah, sorry.
He says, thanks for your answers. If I may follow up, how could editors contribute to making sure that these comments don't happen in the first place?
Wow.
That's for you, Gary.
Well, I mean, we need to train peer reviewers. We need to provide training at journals and at publishers and on sites like Reviewer Credits. If you haven't had a chance to sign up yet on reviewercredits.com, do so, because we have training. There are standards like organizations like the European Association of Science Editors, COPE, have these guidelines for peer review that we should be passing on to peer reviewers. We should be providing peer reviewers with this kind of content.
We absolutely should. But here's another question for you. So this training takes time.
Yes. Right.
And that's something that academics are already, they don't have a lot of. So what incentives are there for people to go out? Because the journals are not offering this training. The editors aren't offering the peer reviewers training. You have to be motivated enough to go and get that training for yourself.
Yep. I mean, at the moment, peer review is pretty much a voluntary process that academics feel that they should do as part of their work, but there's no recognition, no reward for it. Absolutely. This has been talked about a huge amount. There must be a change in the system.
There has to be, because honestly, the people who want to, and I mean, I would love to go and do peer review training. If I could go back and do that as a grad student, I would take my time to do that. The people who care enough about doing this well aren't the ones that are writing the bad reviews. So the ones that are going to go out and get the training aren't the ones necessarily that really needed it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I don't know what the solution is, but I think it's really important that we all just keep working towards making this process better, because it's not like the gatekeeper, but it is a barrier between, if peer review didn't exist, there would be so many papers. It would be impossible to know what is trustworthy and what isn't.
Still remains the gatekeeper
process.
Very
important. It does, but there are so many problems with it.
I know, and I'm aware that we're already over our time for this quick LinkedIn Live event today, but here's a good response, an example of an author response, a real response that creates a good feeling in the editorial office. As Louise was saying, it's important to communicate effectively. It's important to be polite at all stages of the communication process with editors and peer reviewers. Here's an actual email from an author that doesn't create a good impression at the editorial office. I give up! The referees can calm down. They'll just come up with another whinge to delay or frustrate. Editors are working in online systems, clicking buttons, sending papers out for peer review, often not spending a great deal of time looking at who they're sending the papers to. Systems are giving us lists of peer reviewers that are coming up in our systems. And so what we've been talking about today is about how we can potentially deal with negativity in peer review. Louise, it's been fantastic to do this event with you. We'll see you again very soon. And thank you everybody for listening to us on this LinkedIn Live. If you'd like to follow Reviewer Credits, you can do so on reviewercredits.com. Louise, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming.
Have a great day, everybody. Talk to you soon. Follow reviewercredits.com and get in touch. We'll be back soon with another LinkedIn Live.